more competition, and insurance that they can purchase at a lower cost. I thank the President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, first of all, let me commend my friend, the senator from Tennessee. There is no one in this body who is more thoughtful, works harder on issues, and has shown more willingness to kind of find common ground on a host of issues. I also want to compliment the earlier senator who spoke, the senator from Missouri, who laid out a series of items that should be components of any kind of health care reform. As somebody who was a former governor, like the senator from Tennessee, who's managed a Medicaid program, somebody who's been an employer, private sector employer, who's managed private health insurance plans, I know this is a conundrum that has to be solved. What I don't hear sometimes is folks recognizing that the status quo was leading this country on a path that was unsustainable. And I look forward to working with the senator from Tennessee, the senator from Missouri, and others, if we can go about how we can fix where there are challenges in Obamacare. I remember when I voted for what I called a very imperfect piece of legislation, but recognizing the status quo was not a place that could be maintained. Point out a couple of points I want to make. I'm here to talk about the budget, but I do want to make a couple of points that when we talk about the very attractive components of not discriminating against folks with pre-existing condition. I say that with somebody who's got a daughter with a major pre-existing condition. When we talk about preventive care, when we talk about other items that are the kind of nice-to-haves or we like components, any of us who've wrestled with health care, and I started the Virginia Health Care Foundation 20 years ago, realizing when you push on one end of health care, it pops out someplace else. It would be great to be able to do this in segmented parts. But I believe to get the kind of reform that was necessary, you have to make a more extensive program. And what I don't hear sometimes from my colleagues is, while there are, and let's acknowledge the management disaster of the rollout of the website was unprecedented, as someone who stands here from the IT standpoint. But beneath all of these challenges, there are points. If you look at the rise of health care costs on a macro basis, back 3 years past when Simpson Bowles and those of us who were involved in the budget, and that's what I'm here to talk about, got engaged in this issue. You look at the decrease in the amount of health care cost increase. If you look at the slopes decline, it is hundreds of billions of dollars of savings in projected CBO cost of Medicare and Medicaid. If you look at one of the areas that was of enormous concern, one of the broken parts of our health care system, hospital readmission rates, those rates have dropped dramatically. When you look at stories, I hear the stories of folks who are upset with the implementation of Obamacare, but I also hear the stories of folks who've never had health care who are finding it now at rates that are more affordable than in the past, or in the past where they didn't even have an option of getting health care. But this is going to require fixes. I'm going to make a comment on one of the areas that I said, if this notion that the President had made of if you want to have your health care, you can keep it. What this senator has tried to do as we move past the rhetoric into trying to actually how we fix something. I've worked with our state insurance commissioner to take advantage of the opportunity for plans within the Commonwealth of Virginia to try to extend their coverage for at least an additional year. And we're starting to see some progress, not as much as I'd like, but progress on that. Today, with a group of my colleagues, we have written the administration to say so that there is not a gap in coverage, particularly for those folks above the age of 30, that because of the transition maybe find themselves faced with higher costs. Let's present at least a catastrophic plan under the hardship exemption, view that in a broad way so that, again, folks can find in this transition period health care that's affordable. And as someone who believes that we need to make sure that commitment that the President and others, I've stated as well, that you can keep your health care plan, I've joined with Senator Landrieu if these other items don't go far enough for a legislative fix as well. And as other senators have said, there will be other issues coming. When you are going through a reform of 17 to 18% of our whole economy that is connected into health care, it is going to take a willingness of good faith of people on both sides of the aisle to actually not simply relitigate, but to recognize how we move from here. And I would welcome any colleagues that are willing to engage in that kind of productive dialogue, discussion, and laying out of ideas. But this afternoon, we actually are going to be doing something that, in an otherwise fairly bleak year of accomplishments on a Congress that may set record lows in terms of legislation passed and approval ratings, we'll actually end this year with something that I think we should take, at least recognize as a step forward. I'd remind my colleagues it was 2 months ago at this point that we were in the midst of an unprecedented government shutdown, where millions of Americans were furloughed, where America had furloughed 3 Nobel Prize-winning physicists who worked at NASA who were somehow deemed non-essential, where private sector folks in the tourism industry, whether they're in New Mexico or Virginia, we're seeing dramatic fall-off in tourism because of national parks being closed, where we were inflicting upon this economy somewhere in the neighborhood of $30 to $40 billion of economic loss, unprecedented, simply because we couldn't get a budget. Well, this afternoon, and my hopes is that we will at least close that chapter. My hopes is this afternoon, while we will vote on a budget agreement for 2 years that is not as grand or as comprehensive as I would have liked, will demonstrate perhaps to the American people that at least up here we perhaps have to crawl before we can walk, before we can run, and put forward a bipartisan compromise. And a great deal of that credit goes to Chairman Murray and Chairman Ryan, that says for at least the balance of this fiscal year and for the next, let's take off the threat of another shutdown, of unprecedented furloughs. Let's not relax our focus on deficit reduction. Let's not add to the debt. Let's actually do a little bit more, about $20 billion more in deficit reduction, but let's show that these institutions can actually put country ahead of partisan interests. Now, in this compromise, not everyone got what they wanted. I would have argued strongly that the big enchilada remains. How do we really take on, in a major way, that $17 trillion debt that clicks up about $4 billion a night? And that would mean both political parties have to give on their sacred cows. It means we've got to generate additional revenues through meaningful reform of a completely disastrous tax code. And yes, it means for folks like on my side, we've got to make sure that the promise of Medicare and Social Security and other entitlement programs are here not just for this generation, but for 20 and 30 years from now. But some of those challenges will have to be put off to another day. And there are many of us in this body on both sides of the aisle who may have a chance to surprise some folks next year in laying out some ideas, specific ideas, on how we can move to that bigger bargain. But we should not underestimate what we do today. I've spent a longer time in business than I have in elective office. And what this country is yearning for, what consumers are yearning for, what business leaders are yearning for, is just a little bit of predictability. We've seen growth rates go up higher than estimated. We've seen job growth coming quicker than, as monthly revisions are made, going up even higher than we thought. The single best thing we can do is make sure that we remove the cloud of further disruption caused by Washington. So what we do today with this small step, but a step that we shouldn't underestimate, gets rid of that threat for the next 2 years. So I look forward to supporting this bipartisan agreement. As I mentioned, it rolls back the most draconian parts of sequestration. Sequestration, which again was set up to be the most stupid option so that no rational group of people would ever agree to it. I call it stupidity on steroids. So this budget agreement gets rid of the worst brunt of that sequestration and then gives this body and our colleagues in the House the ability to actually fashion a budget for 2 years that will also allow them to allocate within these still lower numbers than historically. But in any compromise, I'll vote for this compromise, but there are particular provisions in this compromise that I would not have agreed to and that I do not support. And that is that component that I believe unfairly singles out our military families. Our military families over the last decade plus have fought 2 wars. They have made unprecedented sacrifices. Oftentimes, they are the only Americans making sacrifices through many of the years of the last decades. And Virginia is home to the nation's largest concentration of active duty and retired military personnel. And I consider it an honor to represent them here in Congress. And the component of the budget compromise that singles out these military retirees for a decrease in their cost of living increase, I think was not an appropriate component. But rather than saying, let's flush the whole deal down, I will vote for this deal, but then with the idea of, similar to my approach to the health care bill, let's go out and if you've got a problem, let's fix it. I've got a fix that I would propose to replace this component going forward. I've been joined in this effort by my friend, the Senator from Virginia as well, Senator Kaine, and my good friend as well, former governor as well, Senator Shaheen, to introduce legislation that would eliminate this close to $6 billion hit on our military retirees. Our legislation would replace, doesn't add to the debt or deficit, our legislation would replace this, I believe, unfair hit to our military retirees by closing certain corporate tax loopholes that would generate sufficient revenue to make sure that our military families would not be unfairly affected. I know in a grander bargain, all things may be on the table. But in this smaller deal, we should not be singling out our military families and those retirees for this undue burden. So I believe and I hope that other colleagues on both sides of the aisle, as we get this budget compromise passed, will join in this effort to substitute out this $6 billion provision for what I believe would be a much more readily acceptable $6 billion provision in terms of change in the corporate tax laws. I know the chairman of the Budget Committee from our side of the aisle would be welcoming this kind of substitution. But her job was to get a deal, and she did that job. She got a deal, and I look forward to supporting it. I'll close with these comments. Virginians have served with honor in our military for generations. And I want to assure our servicemen and women that because of this provision that was put into this budget compromise that doesn't take effect until 2016, we have ample time to make this substitution. I see we're being joined on the floor by Senator Shaheen, one of the original sponsor of this legislation. And I remain committed to working with Senator Shaheen, Senator Kaine, and any member of this body from either party to work on this deficit reduction package, this substitution event that would relieve this burden. Mr. President, I hope that we can build later this afternoon on the overwhelming support this compromise budget measure received in the House, and believe that a strong bipartisan vote today, or actually yesterday when we cleared cloture, was an indication that we'll hopefully get that same kind of vote today. But regardless, it will show that, and I believe we will pass this budget compromise, that this body can work, that American families can go into the holiday season without the potential threat of another government shutdown hitting them mid-January. And I want to close with, again, thanking the chairman of our Budget Committee for the enormous amount of time that she put into this effort. She had lots of folks pushing and pulling her from every direction. And as someone who still aspires to be part of a grander bargain and a bigger deal, our day will come again. But in the meantime, later this afternoon, we do the people's work. We make sure that we do our most essential requirement, which is to present a budget that is fiscally responsible, that takes down our deficit and allows this government to move forward and allows our economy to grow. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Washington.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the final 20 minutes before the cloture vote be equally divided and that I control the final 10 minutes of that.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Hampshire.
Mr. President, this afternoon we will vote to pass a budget for the next 2 years. That sounds really good when we think about actually getting a budget for the next 2 years. And I support this budget because I think it provides the certainty that our businesses and our economy needs, that our families need. It replaces some of the reckless across-the-board cuts known as sequestration and ensures, perhaps most importantly, that we won't have another government shutdown. The alternative, allowing this budget to fail and setting up another government shutdown, is simply unacceptable. We saw the impact that the government shutdown had on our economy, on the people who depend on vital services, as well as on our national defense and our military readiness. So while this budget is not perfect, it's not something that I would have written. I'm sure it's not something that Senator Murray would have written. But the budget deal struck by Senator Murray, the chairman of the Budget Committee and in the Senate, and Congressman Paul Ryan, the chairman of the Budget Committee in the House, is a product of bipartisan compromise. And that's something that we need a whole lot more of in Washington these days. It represents a small but important step forward for our government and for our economy. And while the budget we're going to vote on today is not perfect, I do believe that it is a step forward. It doesn't close a single corporate loophole. It doesn't extend unemployment insurance, which I would like to have seen, for people who have lost their jobs through no fault of their own. That's probably going to cost our economy about 200,000 jobs. And there are provisions included in the bill that I think are misguided and need to be fixed. But the fact is, this is a step forward also in addressing sequestration in a way that I think is absolutely critical to anybody who does business with the federal government or with companies and families who are dependent on services and on contracts with the federal government. I was at BAE Systems in Nashua, New Hampshire on Monday, and I heard from the employees there, from their leadership, how important it was to have a budget for 2 years to provide some certainty for the company so that they knew what programs they're working on, and they do defense contracting. They could count on that it would provide certainty for them, and that's very important because one of the things that we've heard on the defense side of the budget is that the cuts from sequestration were having a very detrimental impact on the readiness of our military, on our men and women who are serving, on the men and women who work for the Department of Defense. We've seen it in New Hampshire at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, where we saw furloughs of people at the shipyard. We saw the impact that the uncertainty as the result of sequestration has been having on the ability to know what they're going to be working on and to be assured that the work will be there in the future. We've seen it with our National Guard in New Hampshire, where the training that they need to have to keep people current is being affected, where people were furloughed as the result of those sequestration cuts. And so this is legislation that will address that in a way that is critical to our national security and critical to the men and women who serve in our military. Now, there are provisions in the bill that I think need to be fixed. I'm very concerned, as so many other people in this body are, with the impact of the bill on military retirees. I'm disappointed that Congressman Ryan was so committed to including this provision in the compromise bill. But one of the things that I wanted to speak to this afternoon is an effort that I'm working on with a number of my colleagues here in the Senate to try and fix that provision, to try and address the negative impacts that the bill might have on military retirees' benefits. Because what the bill does is include an unnecessary reduction in benefits for military retirees under the age of 62. Now, I think there are lots of other ways that we can find budgetary savings rather than cutting those retirement benefits for men and women who have served our nation in uniform. And the good news is that this provision does not go into effect for another 2 years, so we have time to fix this. We've already heard from the chairman of the Armed Services Committee that he is interested in trying to address this provision as we take up the defense authorization bill in the coming year. But I'm ready to get to work right now to address the provision. And yesterday I introduced legislation, the Military Retirement Restoration Act, with 15 of my colleagues, that would replace the military retiree benefit cuts by closing a tax loophole that some corporations are using to avoid paying their fair share of taxes. These corporations set up shell companies in tax havens to avoid being considered an American company, even though they're controlled and operated on American soil. I think most Americans would agree that this kind of tax avoidance is unfair and that we should close this tax loophole rather than reducing military retiree benefits. This is just one idea. I'm certainly open to other solutions. And I hope that we can continue the bipartisan work that began with Senator Murray and Congressman Ryan, that we saw again in the vote to end the filibuster on this bill, that we can continue to work in a bipartisan way to replace the cuts for military retirees' benefits, that we can do it in a way that's smart, but that we can move forward to end the uncertainty, to get a budget in place for 2 years, and to make sure that we address the really devastating impacts that we've seen since March of sequestration, those automatic cuts, and the impact that they're having on the domestic side of the budget, on the defense side. And I see Senator McCain on the floor. I know that earlier today he talked about hearing from every single service, uniformed service leader of the 4 armed services, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, about the impact that further effects of sequestration would have on our national security. I think that is testimony itself to the need to move forward to get this budget deal done and to come back and revisit the concerns we have about other provisions. So thank you very much, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Senator from Arizona.
Unanimous consent to address the Senate as if in morning business.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I thank you, Mr. President. Today I'm introducing Empowering Patients First Act, companion legislation to H.R. 2300, introduced in the House of Representatives by Congressman Tom Price. I would like to thank Congressman Price for all the hard work that he did on this legislation, and I am very grateful for all of that. And I believe that this legislation would give patients, families, the doctors, the power to make medical decisions and not Washington. Specifically, this legislation would enable everyone to purchase health insurance through deductions, credits, or advanceable credits. Equalized tax treatment of employer-sponsored plans and plans purchased by individuals by letting individuals buy health insurance with pre-tax dollars. Let small business owners band together across state lines through association health plans known as AHPs and take advantage of the increased purchasing power that larger businesses are able to take advantage of through increased bargaining power, volume discounts, and administrative efficiencies. It would let consumers buy insurance across state lines and let individuals own their insurance like a 401k plan so they can take it with them across state lines if they change jobs. Mr. President, I don't think there's any doubt in the majority of Americans' minds, and poll after poll indicates that Obamacare is a failure, and the American people do not believe in it. And it isn't just the problems with the rollout of the website. It is all of the aspects of it that have become so complex and so difficult, and basically it is, as some of us who fought it day after day here on the floor, an experiment in social engineering where young people who are healthy are going to pay for the health care of those who are older and sicker. A redistribution of the wealth that then Senator Obama favored when he was running for president. That's not the way to address health care needs in America. It has not bent the health care curve down. It has not allowed people who, if they want to keep their insurance, were able to keep it. I noticed that that was voted as the biggest lie of the year by one of the periodicals here, and it is a failure. So we on the other side of this issue are also required to come up with alternatives, because we vowed to repeal and replace Obamacare, not just repeal it. And I believe that what Congressman Price has introduced and I'm introducing today as a companion bill is a step in that direction. It's time that we on this side of the aisle came up with our agenda for health care in America, because we know that the inflation associated with health care costs is unsustainable, that there are millions of Americans who do not have health care, and there's particular problem with for those with pre-existing conditions. So we need to repeal this horrendous mistake, which, by the way, was done on strictly party line votes, the first entitlement program ever enacted that was done without a single bipartisan vote on it. And as many of us predicted back in 2009 when this legislation was passed, it was doomed to failure. And time after time, amendment after amendment, as we attempted for, I believe it was 25 days of floor consideration back in 2009, was voted down on a party line basis. And now, my friends, they sowed the wind and are now reaping the whirlwind. So we need to repeal the Affordable Care Act, and we need to replace it, because health care in America is still not satisfactory, nor have we fulfilled the needs and our obligations that we have to all of our citizens. The problems with the Affordable Care Act are well known. A failed website rollout that has hindered enrollment in the purchase of mandated coverage. As of December 17th, only an estimated 835 people have enrolled for a health plan. That's 6.2% of the enrollment goal of 7 million by March 31st, 2014. There's a destructive tax on medical devices that will discourage innovation and encourages these businesses to move offshore. We have already seen medical device manufacturers leaving the United States of America, as they said they would if they were taxed to the point where they could not be competitive with medical devices that were manufactured in foreign countries. The disappointment for Americans who are happy with their current coverage to keep their coverage. It's estimated that 10 million Americans will have their health plans terminated due to Obamacare. According to a December 17th Washington Post ABC poll, only 19% of Americans believe Obamacare is improving the country's health care system. Only 8% believe Obamacare is improving their insurance coverage. Only 5% of Americans believe their health care costs are decreasing as a result of Obamacare. And 47% of Americans believe the President's health care law is increasing the cost of their health care. It's clear that Obamacare is not working for the American people, and they have little faith in the administration's effort to fix our broken health care system. This legislation that I'm introducing today makes the purchase of health care financially feasible for all Americans, from deductions to advanceable, refundable credits, so that everyone has an economic incentive to purchase coverage they want for themselves and their families, not what the government forces them to buy. In addition, it allows greater choices and portability so that every health policy is owned by the patient, regardless of who pays. This means the coverage would go with the person if they change or lose their job. It gives employers more flexibility in the benefits offered and provides many more coverage options for people with pre-existing conditions so that no one is priced out of the market regardless of health status. It addresses increasing costs by clamping down on abusive lawsuits, ends the practice of defensive medicine, gains significant savings from health care efficiencies, sifting out waste, fraud, and abuse, and bringing our nation's budget under control. And finally, it establishes doctor-led quality measures, ensuring that patients receive quality care defined by people that know medicine, not by government. It encourages healthier lifestyles by giving employers and health policies more flexibility to offer discounts for healthy habits through wellness and prevention programs. If enacted, this legislation would save trillions of dollars. Douglas Holtz-Eakin, who is a former director of the Congressional Budget Office and one of the most credible people in this town, estimates this legislation would save American taxpayers $2.37 trillion in its first decade alone. According to the analysis of Mr. Holtz-Eakin, compared to current law, this legislation would produce smaller premium increases on average, yielding lower premiums than current law, nearly 19% for single policies and up to 15% for family policies, increase patient access to physicians, produce a 10% increase in medical productivity, and increase the number of insured individuals by 29%. Americans are looking for an alternative to Obamacare. This legislation is a step in the right direction and provide Americans an alternative that empowers patients, families, and doctors to make medical decisions, not in Washington, D.C. Mr. President, I find of interest in the Wall Street Journal, there's an opinion piece, Obamacare's troubles are only beginning, entitled by Michael Boskin, a very well-respected economist, and says, be prepared for eligibility, payment, and information protection debacles and longer waits for care. He says, and I quote, in part, the shocks, economic and political, will get much worse next year and beyond. Here's why. The sticker shock that many buyers of new ACA-compliant health plans have experienced, with premiums 30% higher or more than their previous coverage, has only begun. The cost borne by individuals will be even more obvious next year as more people start having to pay higher deductibles and co-pays. If, as many predict, too few healthy young people sign up for insurance that is overpriced in order to subsidize older, sicker people, the insurance market will unravel in a death spiral of ever higher premiums and fewer sign-ups. The government, through taxpayer-funded risk corridors, is on the hook for billions of dollars of potential insurance company losses. This will be about as politically popular as bank bailouts. And finally, the I can't keep my doctor shock will also hit more and more people in coming months. To keep prices to consumers as low as possible, given cost pressures generated by the government's rules, controls, and coverage mandates, insurance companies in many cases are offering plans that have very restrictive networks with lower cost providers that exclude some of the best physicians in hospitals. Finally, an article entitled Second Wave of Health Plan Cancellation Looms. It goes on to say, an analysis by the American Enterprise Institute, a conservative think tank, shows the administration anticipates half to two-thirds of small businesses would have policies canceled or be compelled to send workers into the Obamacare exchanges. They predict up to 100 million small and large business policies could be canceled next year. Mr. President, I ask that both these articles be included in the record at this time.
Without objection.
So, my friends, it is time for us to begin to consider alternatives and recognize that this legislation needs to be repaired and replaced. I thank my colleagues, and I yield the floor.
Senator from Colorado.
Mr. President, I want to rise today and associate myself with the remarks of my colleague, Senator Shaheen, that she delivered earlier today. She's a fierce supporter of our men and women in uniform, both while they serve our nation and when they retire or leave the military. And I'm an original co-sponsor of her Military Retirement Restoration Act, and I'm also supportive of passing a bipartisan budget deal that prevents our government from shutting down and prevents our defense budget from being slashed. Mr. President, the American people have made it very clear, crystal clear, in fact, that they're tired of gridlock here in Washington. They're tired of the partisan bickering. They're tired of the fact that that's led us to sequestration and the kind of crisis budgeting that's prevented us from getting our fiscal house in order. Now, like I think every one of us, I don't support every provision in the bipartisan budget agreement, but I want to give great credit to Senator Murray and Congressman Ryan for their willingness to sit down together, negotiate in good faith, and come up with a deal that moves our country forward. Let me make it clear that the budget compromise is not perfect, but it's far better than the alternative. And let's be clear what the alternative is: a $20 billion sequester cut to the Department of Defense on January 15th and a much higher likelihood of another government shutdown. Our country simply can't afford more ideological standoffs that lead nowhere. And our men and women in uniform and our national security cannot afford to see those catastrophic cuts. Now, like many of my colleagues, I believe we should find an alternative to the decreases in the cost of living adjustments for working-age military retirees. And that's, again, why I'm proud to co-sponsor Senator Shaheen's legislation, which would do just that. And I'm also committed to working with Chairman Levin and my other colleagues on the Senate Armed Services Committee to continue to find additional ways to protect the retirement that our retirees and their families have earned. Now, these proposed changes don't go into effect, Mr. President, until 2015, and that gives us some room and some time to get together to work on addressing these areas where this bipartisan budget agreement falls short. This is an important agreement. It's important to the Defense Department. It's important to many other programs like Head Start and Meals on Wheels that affect Coloradans every day. It will mean more resources for housing and economic development programs, for roads, small airports, for first responders and those who fight wildfires. The list goes on. And this agreement provides predictability for the individuals, organizations, cities, and businesses in Colorado who need to know what to expect from the federal government. And it does all of this, Mr. President, while providing for a net reduction in the deficit, something we all know must be achieved more often. Mr. President, for all those reasons, I support the bipartisan budget package and urge my colleagues to join me in continuing to find ways to keep faith with our military retirees and their families. Mr. President, if you think about what we're doing with the bipartisan budget agreement, we're creating more certainty for our economy. And I wanted to take a few additional minutes to talk about a driving force in our economy that's creating good-paying American jobs, and that's our manufacturing sector. The manufacturing sector right now supports about 17 million jobs in the United States. Those jobs are the backbone of a strong, thriving middle class, and they prove that it's still possible to make it in America. And in Colorado, our manufacturers literally have the wind at their backs. And I say that because our wind energy industry is not only a critical part of Colorado's manufacturing sector, but it's also an essential component of our Made in America strategy for energy independence. And that's why I'm proud to have successfully fought to ensure that the manufacturers who power our wind energy industry have the policies they need to create jobs and thrive. These policies support American workers, and they ensure that we're giving a leg up to all sources of American-grown energy. I've been proud to lead these efforts here in the Congress, including when I delivered 27 speeches on the Senate floor last year that culminated in the extension of the production tax credit for wind. Now, Mr. President, wind energy, which is enabled by the wind PTC, supports thousands of manufacturing jobs across this country. And that's because building a wind turbine takes a heck of a lot of work. And it involves everyone from steel workers to electricians to computer engineers. These are good-paying, middle-class jobs that help to grow our economy from the middle out. And these are jobs that are not only not being offshored, they can't be offshored. They're staying here in Colorado and across our great nation. To prove that point, just look at this map of wind manufacturing facilities across the United States. There are more than 550 manufacturing facilities in every region of the country, spread across 44 states involved in the wind industry. I'm making sure the presiding officer's state is represented, and I think it is, the great state of Delaware. Here's some of the concerns all across our country. You've got ZF Windbox gear manufacturing in Georgia. You've got TPI Composites, has a turbine plant in Rhode Island. You've got the molded fiberglass blade plant in Texas. And I've got to return to Colorado. We have Vestas in my home state. They have a tower facility, among others. And this all adds up to a wind industry that supports thousands of good-paying American jobs. And as this job-creating industry has taken off, it really couldn't have come at a better time for our manufacturing base, which after a lot of tough years in the wake of the recession is ready for resurgence in a big, big way. A lot of other companies and sectors are outsourcing American jobs. And while that's been happening, the wind industry is cutting against the grain, creating good-paying manufacturing jobs right here in the United States. And in fact, more than 50 new facilities, manufacturing facilities, entered the wind energy market in the last 2 years alone. That's an impressive statistic. It's an accomplishment that we all should be proud of. And the success, Mr. President, of the wind industry is having positive ripple effects on other areas of American manufacturing. And that's because the industry is not only growing, but it is doing so while also increasing its use of American-made components. And this chart makes that point very, very clearly. In 2007, 25% of all wind turbines included American-made parts. And in 2012, as you can see, that number had increased to more than 70%. And it's one of the main reasons for the dramatic increase in manufacturing facilities across our country that support this wind energy industry. And this isn't just about the manifestations of the wind energy world that we think about in blades and towers. It's about gears and nuts and bolts and all of the other made-in-America components that are now helping to power our renewable energy future. But, Mr. President, there's some worrying storm clouds on the horizon, because despite all of this progress, despite all of the American jobs supported by this innovative industry, we are truly, again, at a crossroads for wind energy. The PTC, which I've championed, others have joined me in this chamber, has helped keep our American manufacturing sector strong, but it's once again going to expire in just about 20 days. Previously, I joined many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, including Senator Chuck Grassley, the father of the PTC, to extend this tax credit. Now, with the clock ticking, we need to step up and give this industry the long-term certainty it needs to keep creating jobs and working towards true energy independence. Mr. President, in our pursuit of a balanced approach to energy security, we've supported domestic energy production across the board. I see my good friend from Oklahoma, Senator Coburn, is here. We needed all of the above approach. But if we let the wind PTC expire, we will put one of the cleanest sources of American-made energy at a competitive disadvantage relative to traditional energy sources. And that's because even if the production tax credit for wind expires, tax credits will continue for traditional sources of energy like oil and gas. So we've got a choice to make. Will we act to preserve American manufacturing jobs and support domestically produced clean energy? Or will we choose to do nothing and let other countries claim our manufacturing jobs and the leadership of the new energy economy? These aren't trivial questions. Allowing the wind PTC to expire will cost thousands of American jobs and billions of dollars in investment. And all you have to do is look at what's happened to wind capacity installation over the past 15 years when the PTC has expired. Every time it expires or comes close to expiring, wind installation stalls and American jobs are lost. And we see that pattern, Mr. President, as the year 2000 opened, and 2002, 2004, and now potentially again in 2013. In my home state, you can't talk about manufacturing without talking about the wind industry. Wind manufacturing employs about 1,500 people in Colorado today and supports about 5,000 jobs statewide. As I alluded to earlier, we're home to several manufacturing facilities, including a tower facility, 2 blade plants, and a nacelle factory. They're all operated by the great Vestas company. And last year, due to the lack of certainty about the PTC, no new orders were placed for wind turbines, and Vestas was forced to let go over 600 employees in Colorado alone. That hurt cities like Pueblo and Brighton, whose local economies have significantly benefited from the manufacturing jobs that the wind PTC supports. And after my effort and the effort of others to extend the PTC last year, orders again started flowing, and the Vestas is again hiring workers to meet the market demand. That's good news for Colorado. These are jobs with good benefits. And what concerns me, and I know what concerns Vestas and other Colorado-based companies, is that these jobs can vanish if we here don't act. That's what this is all about, Mr. President. These jobs can vanish if we don't act. So I'm back here. I'm renewing my call from last year. We should act now to extend the wind production tax credit, or we risk losing this industry and the manufacturing jobs that it creates to our competitors. Where are those competitors? They're in China, they're in Europe, and they're elsewhere all over the globe. And that's the last thing our economy needs. The men and women employed in manufacturing facilities across the country are calling on us again in Congress to act. Let's heed their call. Let's act now. The PTC equals jobs. Let's pass it as soon as possible. Let's save these American jobs by extending the production tax credit. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, as chairman of the Committee on Veterans Affairs, I rise today to urge Senate passage of S. 944, the Veterans Health and Benefits Improvement Act of 2013. This bipartisan legislation is the result of months of hard work by my colleagues from both sides of the aisle. This legislation was passed out of committee by voice vote. There were no objections that took place on July 24th, and this legislation is paid for. This legislation is paid for. Furthermore, this legislation is supported by nearly every major veteran and military service organization in our country, including the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, the Military Officers Association of America, the American Legion, the Vietnam Veterans of America, the Association of the United States Navy, the Reserve Officers Association, the Jewish War Veterans, the Enlisted Association of the National Guard of the United States, the National Association for Uniformed Services, AMVETS, Gold Star Wives, the National Congress of American Indians. It would, in fact, I think, be a very good and statement about what we are trying to do as a nation if the Senate could pass this comprehensive veterans bill before we adjourn, so we can get about the business of working with our House colleagues to get important veterans legislation passed by both bodies signed into law. Mr. President, let me very briefly highlight some of the key provisions of this very important piece of legislation. Again, legislation that is bipartisan, came out of the committee unanimously, and has the support of virtually every veterans organization. Ranking Member Burr and I have worked together on a provision that would help service members transition back into civilian life by making recently separated veterans eligible for tuition at the in-state rates. This has been a very contentious issue, but what we do is make recently separated veterans eligible for tuition at the in-state rate, something that many of the veterans organizations and people all over this country have wanted. Given the nature of our armed forces, service members have little to say as to where they serve and where they reside during military service. This legislation would help our brave men and women who have sacrificed so much in defense of our country transition by giving them a fair shot at attaining their educational goals without incurring an additional financial burden simply because they chose to serve their country. It's an issue I know discussed in the House a great deal, discussed here a great deal. We have reached resolution on this important issue. Further, Mr. President, while the Pentagon, Congress, and other stakeholders continue to work to end sexual assault within the ranks, and this is an enormously important issue, I want to do everything within my power as chairman of the VA to ensure that VA is a warm and welcoming place for those survivors of military assault. That is why this legislation contains important provisions that would improve the delivery of care and benefits to veterans who experience sexual trauma while serving in the military, which was inspired by Ruth Moore, who struggled for 23 years to receive VA disability compensation. It would expand access to VA counseling and care to members of the Guard and Reserves who experience sexual assault during an inactive duty training. It also takes a number of steps to improve the adjudication of claims based on military sexual trauma. This legislation would give VA additional tools to do all that it can to provide victims of sexual trauma with the care and benefits they need to confront the emotional and physical consequences of these horrific acts. Maintaining VA's world-class health care system remains a priority for this committee, and this legislation does just that. I am pleased that we were able to respond to calls from veterans to increase access to complementary and alternative medicine for the treatment of chronic pain, mental health conditions, and chronic disease. By expanding the availability of these treatment options, we can enhance the likelihood veterans get the treatment they need in ways that work for them. Additionally, this legislation calls for VA to promote healthy weight in veterans by increasing their access to fitness facilities, as a healthy weight is critical to combating multiple chronic diseases, including diabetes and heart disease. By managing veterans' obesity, we can both improve their overall health and reduce the costs to the health care system. Mr. President, every member of this body knows all too well the challenges of the claims backlog. I am pleased to see VA making progress on this complex issue, but much more remains to be done. This legislation supports VA's ongoing efforts and would make needed improvements to the claims system. Among a number of claims-related provisions, this bill for the first time would require the Department of Veterans Affairs to publicly report on both claims processing goals and actual production. This would allow Congress and the public to closely track and measure VA's progress on this difficult issue. Mr. President, this bill also addresses a number of concerns presented to the Veterans Affairs Committee by the Gold Star wives earlier this year by improving the benefits and services provided to surviving spouses. The Veterans Health and Benefits Improvement Act would provide additional dependency and indemnity compensation for surviving spouses with children in order to provide financial support in the difficult period following the loss of a loved one. This bill also expands the Marine Gunnery Sergeant John David Fry Scholarship to include surviving spouses of members of the armed forces who die in the line of duty. Mr. President, as you can see, the Veterans Health and Benefits Improvement Act contains provisions that will improve the lives of our nation's service members, veterans, and their survivors. I am proud of the bipartisan manner in which the Veterans Affairs Committee has conducted its business to produce this important legislation. Our veterans deserve far more help from the United States Congress than they have received, and I ask, Mr. President, unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the consideration of calendar number 258, S-944, the committee-reported substitute amendment be agreed to, the bill as amended be read a third time and passed, the committee-reported title amendment be agreed to, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Mr. President, is there objection?
I object.
Objection is heard.
Well, I'm disappointed that there is objection to a bill that came out of the committee without objection, that was done in a bipartisan manner, that is paid for, and that has the support of virtually every Veterans Committee. I would hope, Mr. President, if there is objection to unanimous consent, that there would not be objection to a roll call vote on this bill.
Mr. President.
The senator from Oklahoma.
There'll be an objection to a roll call vote because the opportunity to amend this bill has not been made available to members of the Senate. And I have two specific concerns with the bill. I'm writing my whole letter right now on this bill, and until they're addressed, I'm going to hold this bill until I have an opportunity to amend the bill. I yield the floor.
Well, I understand the senator's objection. I am disappointed. It takes forever to get anything done in this body, and you have a situation now where we have seen a process develop in the Veterans Committee by which there has been bipartisan support. It's kind of the way things are supposed to be done, and yet, because of that objection, we are going to be unable to move forward in the way that I think most of the members want. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Senate about an hour away or so from a final passage vote on the two-year budget agreement, which passed by the House last week. They are in a quorum call. We're going to show you some debate from earlier, a colloquy actually, with Senator Murray, who appears to be coming back to the podium, so we'll wait just a moment here on C-SPAN 2. The Budget Committee Chairman Patty Murray leaving the Senate floor moments ago. She was speaking there with Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican of South Carolina, who
Mr. President. Senator from South Carolina.
Thank you. Let me just inform you what I'm trying to do. We were told, myself, Senator Ayotte, and Wicker had some time at 4 to...
The senator is reminded that we are in a...
I would ask unanimous consent to get out of the quorum call.
Without objection.
Okay. What I'm trying to do, Mr. President, we were told to come down here. We had a 4 o'clock time. Glad to be able to discuss things.